Hi, I'm Jeanette Roche. This is Bridge City News. Here are some of the top stories we've been following. The Bank of Canada rate remains at 5% today, but could lower its rate as early as June. Plus, the PM's cabinet ministers testify at a foreign interference inquiry. And could Canada be headed for another horrific wildfire season?
Your nation. Your province. Your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Jeanette Roche.
Thanks so much for joining us. The Bank of Canada could lower its key interest rate as soon as June. For now, the rate is going to stay at 5%, but Central Bank Governor Tiff Macklem says a June rate cut is within the realm of possibilities because he's starting to see the economic conditions necessary to lower interest rates. That includes the slowdown in underlying inflation to continue. He says economic data since January has improved the central bank's confidence that inflation will continue to slow even as economic growth improves.
Economic growth is forecast to strengthen in 2024. Strong population growth is increasing consumer demand, as well as the supply of workers, and spending by households is forecast to recover through the year. Spending by governments also contributes to growth, and U.S. strength supports Canadian exports. Overall, we forecast GDP growth in Canada of 1.5% this year and about 2% in 2025 and 2026.
Economists widely expected today's announcement and have been predicting the central bank will deliver the first rate cut in June. Canada could be headed for a repeat of the worst wildfire season on record that burned more than 15 million hectares of land last year and forced 230,000 people from their homes. Federal officials say persistent drought and months of above-average temperatures have created conditions ripe for an early and above-normal fire risk from Quebec all the way to British Columbia, both this month and next. While lightning is the main source of wildfire in the summer, the head of the Northern Forestry Center says humans represent the main risk factors in the spring. A Conservative motion is being debated at the House of Commons today, calling for a televised meeting with Justin Trudeau on the federal carbon levy. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe says he's willing to attend the sit-down with his provincial counterparts and the Prime Minister. Moe says he believes it would give Saskatchewan a chance to highlight what the province is doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Trudeau's response has been that he met with the premiers in 2016 when the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change was first established. Recently, Prime Minister Trudeau has crisscrossed Canada, making funding announcements, which some have criticized because it steps on the toes of provincial governments. Now it appears that Alberta is looking to introduce legislation to prevent municipal governments from making deals with Ottawa. BCN contributor Tyler Dawson, the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, explains this in more detail.
In the current context, what that means is that the provincial government is not necessarily happy with the federal government saying, aha, maybe we disagree with the province on something, but maybe if we go to the cities, we can give them money, we can hash out a deal with them and achieve at least a portion of this goal that we have, whether that's housing, whether that's transit funding, perhaps that's road funding, other infrastructure funding, things like that. So the province basically wants to be able to say, these are our priorities, these are the priorities that we feel the city should have, and they should not be, sidestepping whatever our plans are in order to make deals with the federal government.
Catch more of my interview with Tyler Dawson on provincial politics coming up after business news. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has taken the stand to testify as part of a federal inquiry into foreign meddling in Canada's last two elections. Trudeau's cabinet ministers also continued to testify at the inquiry, with former Minister Karina Gould saying Canada's spy agencies saw low-level Chinese interference activities in the 2019 election. And the director of the 2019 Liberal election campaign says he recommended the Prime Minister take no action on alleged nomination irregularities in a Toronto riding. Jeremy Broadhurst's testimony at the foreign interference inquiry sheds fresh light on allegations of Chinese interference in the selection of Han Dong as the Liberal nominee in Don Valley North.
We were being presented with information from intelligence reporting that suggested that there could have been irregularities in the nomination process, the Liberal Party's nomination process for one of our candidates in the general election. That is important enough for me to think that the leader of the party should be aware of them and make a determination about if there was any action that he felt it was appropriate to take. I provided him with the information based on the information that we had at that time, and based on what I thought should be an extremely high bar for overturning a democratic result. I had recommended to the Prime Minister that no action be taken.
And just to recap, former Liberal MP Han Dong testified back on April 2nd that he met with international Chinese students at a private school and encouraged them to register as Liberal members during his nomination race in 2019. In the testimony during a federal inquiry into the foreign election interference, Dong says he forgot to mention that a busload of international students did show up to vote in his nomination race, and he did not view it as anything irregular at the time.
I didn't pay attention to, busing international students because at the time I didn't understand it as a irregularity.
You didn't understand it as an irregularity?
That's right. To be international student, I met them, canvassed them, signed up. They showed up to vote. To me, it's pretty regular.
Why did you solicit support for your nomination campaign from international students?
Well, it was a short period of time for the campaign, and I was reaching out to as many groups as I can, senior groups, student groups, looking for volunteers, and if they live in the riding eligible to vote, and I encouraged them to sign up as liberal members.
Health Minister Mark Holland says concerns and fears dentists are expressing about a national dental care plan are similar to those doctors had when Canada launched Medicare in the 1960s. He is defending his government's back and forth negotiations with dentists after dental associations said some of their members are hesitant to participate. Dentists and hygienists associations have raised concerns about Ottawa's pay structure, saying the proposed fees are lower than what patients are currently being billed.
One of the red lines for me is that patients aren't going to pay. There's a lot of providers who want patients to pay out of their own pocket. We can't do that. These are vulnerable people who can't afford to pay out of their own pocket. So that's a red line. But outside of that, on administrative burden, we set up a task group to really get that administrative burden down as low as it can possibly get. And for me, that makes the standard is for it to be identical to any other insurance process. Somebody can walk in, show their card, plug it in. They're going to be paid within 2 days. Make it a very, very simple, easy process.
The program is expected to provide dental coverage to uninsured families who earn a household income of under $90,000. It is being rolled out in phases, beginning with the eldest Canadians and expanding to all seniors 65 and older in May, when applicants are expected to begin receiving coverage. The government forecasts this program will cost $13 billion over 5 years. The story of a 5-year-old Italian orphan who was nurtured by Canadian soldiers during the Second World War seems like a far-fetched tale, but it really happened. As BCN's Naveen Day reports, you can soon see the story behind it all on the silver screen.
Gino was 5 years old. He was a lonely orphan in the midst of a terrible war.
A Canadian-made docudrama based on a true story is set to hit the screens at the Movie Mill this May. Glenn Miller, president of the Lethbridge United Services Institute, shares what the flick is all about.
The docudrama is called Gino, A Child of War, and it's a story of how some Canadian soldiers in Italy found a 5-year-old orphan, and they were able to adopt him into their camp lifestyle, had a little uniform for him, and were able to actually care as soldiers of someone young. And the person went on to live through the war and become a successful engineer in Italy, and will be actually coming back to Canada next year to lay a wreath at the graves of one of his soldiers that found him.
Miller adds that those who see the movie are allowed a unique user experience by having a rare question and answer session after the film with those who brought the production to life. He also says the movie is important for people of all ages and generations to watch, as it adds a human element to what a soldier really is.
As we go through the battlefields of Europe, this puts on a human dimension of what a soldier is. It's not just the battle. They have family members at home. They have children. When I went to Bosnia, I had a young girl, so I could relate as a father looking at young kids in a different country. And so this is a very important story for the Italian community here in Lethbridge and for everyone else in southern Alberta.
Gino, A Child of War premieres on Sunday, May 5th at 2 p.m. at the Movie Mill. Tickets are $10, available from the bar at the Lethbridge Legion. For Bridge City News, I'm Naveen Day.
Raymond RCMP are investigating a suspicious occurrence that happened Tuesday at approximately 4 p.m. on Highway 52 and 100E. The investigation reveals that an unknown man pulled up in a vehicle next to a child and told her to get into the vehicle. When she refused, he turned and went in the opposite direction. RCMP wished to identify this man to speak with him about the incident. He's described as having a fair complexion with red hair and is in his early to mid-20s. He was driving a vehicle which is believed to be a gray or silver SUV bearing a license plate which possibly contains the characters CF and 235. Anyone with information regarding this incident is asked to contact Raymond RCMP at the number on your screen. A special public information session about intelligence-led policing is coming up on April 22nd from 2:30 till 4:30 p.m. at the Lethbridge Public Library. The focus will be on the use of analytics and intelligence to reduce crime. Presenters include Lethbridge Police Chief Shaheen Medizadeh and Stefan Contra, an expert in analytics and management at Lethbridge Police Service. The fee is $20. You can register for it through the Lethbridge Chamber of Commerce or the Lethbridge Public Library. A strike has been averted at the Palliser School Division. Palliser teachers ratified a mediator's recommended terms of settlement to end local bargaining with the school division. At a virtual meeting held Monday evening, teachers voted 64% in favor of the recommendations, thereby avoiding a need for any labor action. Palliser was the last of 61 school divisions to reach agreements for the current term of bargaining, which extends back to September of 2020. The Palliser School Division employs approximately 700 contracted and substitute teachers in public schools in Colehurst, Coaldale, Picture Butte, Vulcan, and surrounding areas. Muslims around the world were celebrating the Eid holiday Wednesday, marking the end of the Islamic holy month with prayers, family reunions, and sweet treats, but the celebrations were overshadowed by the worsening humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip and Israel's expected offensive in the city of Rafah, despite efforts from its Western allies to halt the fighting after 6 months of war. South of the border, former President Donald Trump is facing political pressure on the issue of abortion rights and now says an Arizona law that criminalizes nearly all abortions goes too far. He's urging state politicians to change it, but he's also defending the U.S. Supreme Court's decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, which cleared the way for states to ban the procedure. Yesterday's Arizona Supreme Court ruling could mean a 1864 law banning abortion at all stages of pregnancy with no exceptions for rape or incest will be enforced. Trump arrived in Atlanta Wednesday for a fundraiser with prominent GOP figures and donors and spoke with reporters about abortion developments.
So for 52 years, people have wanted to end Roe v. Wade to get it back to the states. We did that. It was an incredible thing, an incredible achievement. We did that, and now the states have it, and the states are putting out what they want. It's the will of the people. So Florida's probably going to change. Arizona's going to definitely change. Everybody wants that to happen. And you're getting the will of the people.
And speaking of the former president, retired Trump Organization Chief Financial Officer Alan Weisselberg received a 5-month jail sentence after he admitted he'd lied under oath about the size of Trump's Manhattan penthouse during his testimony in Trump's civil fraud trial. Weisselberg appeared in court casually dressed and ready to serve his sentence. He declined to address the court, as did his defense attorneys and prosecutors. He was led away in cuffs to begin serving his sentence immediately. And today, President Joe Biden welcomed Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to the White House for talks on the delicate security situation in the Pacific and for a glitzy state dinner. Biden is honoring a leader who's been one of his strongest international allies. And in other news, exit polls are suggesting a landslide win by South Korea's liberal opposition parties in the country's parliamentary election Wednesday. Initial exit polls suggested a result that, if confirmed, would make conservative President Yoon Suk-yeol a lame duck for the remaining 3 years in office. And check this out. An athlete climbed the Eiffel Tower with a rope to set a new world record today. Elite obstacle course racer and double world champion Anouk Garnier set the new world record in a rope climb of 110 meters at the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France. Wow, no thanks, not my thing, but what is my thing is the weather that we're about to embark on. Beautiful teen temperatures for the rest of the week. I'll be back after the break with a full look at the forecast. Welcome back. Partly cloudy skies this evening with 20 to 40 winds from the northwest. Overnight low of -2. As we get into tomorrow, mainly sunny skies on Thursday with increasing clouds by the afternoon there. Lovely temperature though, high of 16 degrees. Also the 20 to 40 wind on Thursday from the southwest. As we get into Friday, high of 15. Same thing for Saturday with lots of sunshine though. And then on Sunday, clear skies and 14. Those clouds will start to develop by Friday evening though, turning into showers on Monday. So we're looking at a 60% chance of showers Monday with a high of 12 degrees. And then we're seeing a drop in temperature Tuesday down to 5 degrees and then a 60% chance of showers or flurries. Sorry to break it to you. Okay, average high for this time of year, 12 degrees, average low -2. 24 was our record high temperature that happened back in 1949. And the record low on this day happened in 1990. It was a -19, very chilly -19, mind you. 6:47, that's when the sun rose this morning. Sunset this evening at 8:18. We're looking at 13 hours. 31 minutes of daylight. Okay, a little bit of a rainy one on the west coast tomorrow. Victoria seeing showers, 10 degrees for a high, and showers beginning in the morning tomorrow in Vancouver with a high of 9 degrees. 15 for a high in Edmonton, looking at 20 to 40 winds there. And then same thing in Calgary, 20 to 40 winds with a high of 13 degrees with partly cloudy skies. As we look to the rest of the prairies, Saskatoon sitting at 12 degrees. Same thing for Regina. Beautiful sunny weather in both of those cities. And then partly cloudy skies as we get into Winnipeg there. High of 14 degrees though. Very rainy in Toronto tomorrow. We're seeing 5 to 10 millimeters of rain. Risk of an afternoon thunderstorm. 16 for a high though. Up to 18 as the expected high tomorrow in Ottawa. Looking at 5 millimeters of rain and 60% chance of showers tomorrow in Montreal with a high of 6 degrees. As we get into Atlantic Canada, we are seeing a bit of shower activity, particularly in Fredericton and Halifax, looking at 30% chance of showers in both of those cities. High of 8 in Fredericton, 10 for a high in Halifax, high of 9 in Charlottetown with mixed cloud and sun there, and mainly clear skies in St. John's tomorrow with a high of 4 degrees. So there you have it. That is your forecast. The Bank of Canada says it's keeping its overnight interest steady at 5%, but announced it's raising its nominal neutral interest rate. That's the rate at which the central bank's monetary policy is neither stimulating nor holding back the economy. That metric is now estimated to be between 2.25 and 3.25%. That's up from 2 to 3% in the central bank's last report. Desjardins Managing Director Royce Mendes Menendez says the bank's projection is relatively optimistic despite the uptick. The neutral rate is now the same as it was for much of 2019 when the overnight rate was 1.75%. Canadian energy producers say they are prepared for the possibility of another spring and summer of drought and wildfires. Oil and gas companies in northwest and central Alberta, as well as northeast BC, were forced to temporarily halt production last year as wildfires raged across key fossil fuel producing regions. New Vista Energy's CEO Jonathan Wright says if this year turns out to be another significant wildfire season, New Vista's field operators will be using satellite imagery to track the course and progression of any blazes. Birchcliff Energy CEO Chris Carlson says his company has built its own water storage reservoirs and is confident it has enough water saved to execute its 2014 drilling program if drought is an issue this summer. Now here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was down 162 points on the day to finish at 22,199. The Dow was down 422 to 38,461. The S&P 500 was down 49 points to 5160, and the Nasdaq was down 136 points to finish at 16,170. West Texas Intermediate oil was up $1.01 to $86.24 U.S. per barrel. Natural gas was even at $1.88 U.S. Gold was down $18.74 to $2,334.04 U.S. an ounce, and silver was down 20 cents to $27.95 U.S. an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.57 per bushel, barley is at $6.47, canola is at $13.60, and corn is at $7.80 per bushel. Live cattle were down $1.63 to $179.08. Feeder cattle were down $2.43 to $238.28. Lean hogs were up $1.15 to $91.75, and the Canadian dollar was even over the past 24 hours at 73.09 U.S.
Recapping one of our top stories, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has taken the stand to testify as part of a federal inquiry into foreign meddling in Canada's last two elections. Trudeau's cabinet ministers also continued to testify at the inquiry, with former Minister Karina Gould saying Canada's spy agency saw low-level Chinese interference activities in the 2019 election, and the director of the 2019 Liberal election campaign says he recommended the Prime Minister take no action on alleged nomination irregularities in a Toronto riding. Jeremy Broadhurst's testimony at the foreign interference inquiry sheds fresh light on allegations of Chinese interference in the selection of Han Dong as the Liberal nominee in Don Valley North. Coming up, Tyler Dawson, the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, gives an update on all the hot-button issues in Alberta politics. Also, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca, and be sure to visit our website anytime to check out a number of stories and interviews.
Here's today's Bridge City News Community Calendar. Henderson Lake Park Run invites all to throw on a pair of runners and participate in a free weekly computer-timed and recorded 5-kilometer walk, jog, or run. The park run is one of 2,100 park runs held around the world. Dogs on leashes and kids in strollers are welcome too. The park run begins at the Kinsman Picnic Shelter at 9 a.m. every Saturday. To register, visit parkrun.ca. Celebrate Recovery is a Christ-centered recovery program for any hurt, hang-up, and habit. This group meets Friday nights at Park Meadows Baptist Church. The evening begins at 7 p.m. with a large group session, followed by small groups at 8 with coffee and dessert at 9. For more information, visit celebraterecovery.ca or call Park Meadows Church office at 403-327-4422. And that's today's Bridge City News Community Calendar.
Well, this past week, we've seen the Prime Minister making funding announcements in Alberta. Now the Premier is pushing back, and she's got the Mayor of Calgary upset about it. So much happening in provincial politics this week. And to break it down, I'm joined by Tyler Dawson, who is the Alberta correspondent for the National Post. Tyler, great to have you on again. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've recently seen the Prime Minister making a cross-country campaign-like tour to announce extra funding for housing in certain municipalities. And just last week, he visited Calgary. Now, there's been some criticism that he's stepping on the toes of issues that should be left up to provincial governments. So now it looks like the Alberta government will soon introduce legislation to prevent municipal governments from making direct deals with the federal government. Tyler, can you give us more details about this?
Yeah, so this is actually not a super new idea in Alberta. Jason Kenney had sort of pitched the similar thing, and it had not really gone anywhere. And Quebec actually already has similar rules. And the gist of this is that municipalities are, yes, they're the third level of government, but they're also very much creatures of the province. And so the province has quite a bit of, sort of legal constitutional sway over the way cities operate. And in the current context, what that means is that the provincial government is not necessarily happy with the federal government saying, aha, maybe we disagree with the province on something, but maybe if we go to the cities, we can give them money, we can hash out a deal with them and achieve at least a portion of this goal that we have, whether that's housing, whether that's transit funding, perhaps that's road funding, other infrastructure funding, things like that. So the province basically wants to be able to say, these are our priorities, these are the priorities that we feel the city should have, and they should not be, sidestepping whatever our plans are in order to make deals with the federal government. So this is, as I say, not particularly new, certainly going to be complicated. As you can imagine, there's all sorts of things that fall under municipal and provincial jurisdiction. There's all sorts of potential funding arrangements or deals you can imagine being made. So it'll be, I think, a little bit tricky to write legislation around this and to enforce it and manage it in a way that is still allows for a functioning government. But this is part of the province wanting to make sure that the municipalities are all sort of on the same side of the issues as they are. Also, a bit of a jab in the eye at Justin Trudeau. As is off, I bring this up all the time when we talk about Alberta-Ottawa issues. Would this be the sort of thing the government of Alberta would be pursuing if it was a Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre we were talking about, or is this, a little bit of a conservative versus liberal, Alberta versus Ottawa kind of thing going on? So I think there's the on the ground effects of this, but there's also the political dynamic of just not being that happy about, as you say, Ottawa coming in and stepping on a few toes.
Right, and I understand that Calgary Mayor Jody Gondik is not very happy with Premier Smith about this either.
No, she's not, and it's good you brought that up because you can imagine that municipal leaders are like, oh, fabulous, we want money for whatever. Maybe the feds have it, or the feds come knocking and they're thrilled to have the money. And so that's essentially what she's saying. She's saying, well, this creates a whole other layer of bureaucracy. If the federal government needs to go through the province, and the province to us, then us to the province, and the province to the feds, you can imagine that it could potentially slow down the receipt of money. It can slow down deal making, things like that. So she's not wildly happy. And I actually would be skeptical if any municipal politician was wildly enthusiastic about this, because they probably like the independence that they have.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, speaking of municipalities, the Alberta government is also moving ahead with legislation that would allow for municipal political parties. So, Tyler, can you explain?
Well, again, we have to look to Quebec a little bit on this, and British Columbia as well. So Vancouver City Council has political parties, and Montreal City Council has political parties. And basically, the United Conservatives argue that to have political party labels on candidates would essentially just be a transparency issue. I mean, you look at any municipal councillor, you more or less know what their political affiliations are, what their political views are. Does it change it that dramatically to say Councillor X, is an NDP member, or maybe some new party in Alberta, Progressive Party member or something like that? So they say this is basically a matter of transparency. People have labels, voters will know who they are. It won't just be a matter of name recognition. Maybe a local celebrity runs for council or something. You'd be able to know what their affiliations are beyond just their name. So that's sort of the argument in favor of it. That's sort of the argument the government is making. Critics say, well, look, how well does the partisan political system function in the legislature when everyone spends all day trying to claw each other's eyes out? How well does it work in Ottawa? And why would we bring that dysfunction to municipal councils. And so that's what Alberta Municipalities, a sort of advocacy group that represents, hundreds, I guess, of towns, villages, and cities around the province are saying. They're saying, well, look, if transparency is the issue, there's maybe other ways to do that. There could be donation limits to municipal councillors. There could be disclosure, financial disclosure rules. There's all these other things, they say, that could be done that wouldn't bring political parties into the system. So, again, old idea, is done elsewhere, is rarely done elsewhere in Canada, only really 2 big cities, and certainly very, very controversial because, again, something the province might like, probably something that municipal folks wouldn't like that much. And the other thing that I should add on this, which is related but slightly different, is Conservatives don't tend to perform super well in municipal elections, specifically in Edmonton and Calgary. Mayor Jyoti Gondek, quite a progressive mayor. Mayor Amarjeet Sohi in Edmonton, quite a progressive mayor. Edmonton has a very progressive council, for example, Calgary as well. And so there is the belief in some Conservative circles that if they could get party labels on these people, on the Conservative candidates and the progressive candidates, they might have more luck getting more ideologically inclined or aligned people into council chambers. So that's sort of the other side of this, the political side of this.
Very interesting. Now, Tyler, earlier you mentioned Alberta versus Ottawa, and here we have Premier Danielle Smith, who will be speaking at the Strong and Free Conference this week in Ottawa. So, Tyler, can you explain what this is and what Smith will be speaking about?
Yeah, so this used to be called the Manning Conference, and it's now the Canada Strong and Free Conference, Canada Strong and Free Network Conference. And it's basically just this big confab of Conservative thinkers from around the country. They all get together and talk politics and drink a lot of beer. And so it's going to feature a couple other famous names. Boris Johnson's going to be there. Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia, is going to be there. And Danielle Smith is giving an address as well. Don't know specifically what she's going to talk about, but I do think, from a Conservative perspective, she's probably going to talk about Alberta's relationship with the Liberals, since there's lots to say on that, and certainly Conservatives are more concerned about it, let's say, than Liberals are. So I think that would probably make up a big portion of it. It would not surprise me if she talked about safe supply and the opioid epidemic. It would not surprise me if she spoke about the carbon tax, because you certainly can't get a group of Conservatives in the room and not talk about the carbon tax. So that's sort of what I would expect from her. And she's relatively prominent in the Conservative movement, I guess, in Canada. There's been quite a bit of turnover, I think, in sort of the grand old guard of Conservative Party politics these days. So I think she'll probably get a pretty good reception. And she's a character, I think, that Conservatives across the country tend to care a fair bit about. There was a lot of interest in the Alberta Sovereignty Act when it was announced, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now you mentioned the opioid crisis there, and of course that means addiction. So the Alberta government is spending $5 million on a new Canadian Centre of Recovery Excellence, which is a mental health, it's part of the Mental Health and Addictions Crown Corporation, right? So Tyler, this is basically a recovery-oriented perspective on addiction and mental health, isn't it?
Yeah, so what they call the Alberta model is basically the idea that addicts should be sort of run up this system where the end goal is recovery. The end goal is to break the addiction, get them into treatment, return them to society and jobs and housing and all that sort of thing. And it's obviously a very controversial idea. There's lots of debate in addictions and mental health circles about the best way to approach people, treat people, meet them where they're at, that sort of thing. But for the last few years, since Jason Kenney became premier, really, Alberta's been pushing this idea of recovery-oriented treatment quite strongly. And so this center that they're funding is going to be sort of a research and analysis organization. What is the research telling us about the best way to tackle addiction? What is the, if you have a recovery center or an addictions facility doing treatment, this Crown Corporation might do an analysis of their work. So it does seem to be framed sort of within this Alberta model, this recovery-oriented model that I spoke about. And this has also led to some controversy because, as I say, there's the big debate over this. So is the government, funding a research center that's going to come back with just research that's, ideologically friendly towards them? And Dan Williams, the addictions and mental health minister, said, no, they'll be allowed to do and publish research that won't align with our political priorities necessarily. But of course, that hasn't totally allayed some of the concerns that folks have. So it'll be interesting to see what they do when they get up and running. There is some suggestion that they might partner with, say, the University of Calgary, the University of Alberta, University of Lethbridge on some of these research projects. So remains to be seen exactly what that's going to look like, still in the early phases of it, but certainly a part of this much larger scheme of the Alberta perspective on recovery.
Okay, here's sort of a disturbing one. The Alberta Teachers Association released data this week detailing the stressors they face in the classroom, and it looks like 52% of teachers have come across aggression or threats of violence in their classroom, and that is an exceptionally high number. Now, the Alberta Teachers Association is saying it believes this comes from social changes during the pandemic. Tyler, can you go into detail a bit more about what Jason Schilling is talking about?
Yeah, so the idea is that there's been basically bad behavior in the schools is maybe the simplest way to sort of simplify it. And there's, aggression on the part of students towards teachers, aggression between students. There's some parental aggression being directed at parents and things like that. And so they, raise these concerns of what teachers are having to deal with sort of on a daily basis, perhaps. And they also try and pin down, what are some of the things that teachers are hearing among students or directed at them. And some of that is, political in terms of the pandemic. Some of that is based on race or gender. And so they're basically saying that, look, we had the pandemic that created some obvious sort of social schisms in society, a lot of anger on both sides. You have the effects of social media where young people are exposed to, say, influencers who have violent or misogynistic views. You have you've content coming at them daily about all the horrors of the world, and that this sort of stuff is sort of ending up in classrooms and in schools. And you also have, as a consequence of the pandemic, as a consequence of social media, perhaps a decline in empathy between kids, between parents and teachers and other students and things like that. So they're basically suggesting that there's this bubbling pot of sort of what you would call social problems, I think, if we were talking about adults or workplace or something like that they're seeing in classrooms. And they're just sort of raising the alarm and saying, look, we're dealing with these things on a daily basis between students, and people should be aware of what we're dealing with, and also how their students, their kids are behaving in the classroom. So pretty eye-opening stuff. A bit hard to say what some of those things are, what is being perceived as threatening, what is being perceived as aggression, what is being perceived as inappropriate comments and whatnot. It's easy to imagine that there are high school students having a debate about something that could be perceived as harmful or unkind to other students. So, obviously a lot of other factors go into play here, but, I think the conclusion at the end of the day is teachers saying, look, we're dealing with sort of this unprecedented drama among students, and the public needs to know about it.
Well, it's unprecedented times, that's for sure. I think kids are dealing with a lot, teachers are dealing with a lot. And then speaking of schools and students, kids, since last September, Saskatchewan has been fighting in court to preserve its pronoun rules in schools, which says that those 15 years old and younger must get parental consent to use different pronouns or names in school. And it looks like the Alberta government is now an intervener in this case, so they'll be making their own legal arguments about it at some point in the future. So Tyler, can you maybe tell us more about this?
Yeah, so this, as you say, has been running since about September. And what happened is a little bit complicated, but basically Saskatchewan announced this policy. They were sued by sort of the Pride Center in Regina, I think it was. And the Pride Center got an injunction basically saying that the government cannot implement this legislation, this policy change, until the courts decide whether it's constitutional. Saskatchewan responded by passing legislation called the Parents' Bill of Rights, and they invoked the Notwithstanding Clause, the section of the Constitution that allows a government to override charter protections. So that could have been the end of it. But what the Pride Center did is they brought in new legal arguments. They said, well, we've made all these arguments under sections of the charter that can be overridden by the Notwithstanding Clause. But now they're arguing that this also violates Section 12 of the charter, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And Section 12 of the charter cannot be overridden by the Notwithstanding Clause. So this is a new legal avenue. And so earlier this year, I think February or January, the court said, well, even though the Notwithstanding Clause has been used, even though this bill has become law, there is this line of legal argument that needs to be considered. So it is going to be heard, I believe, by the Court of Appeal in Saskatchewan. Now, Saskatchewan's not very happy about that. They're saying, well, we already dealt with this case. We passed the Notwithstanding Clause. We passed the legislation. There's no legal argument there. That's not what the court thinks at this point. And so Alberta's getting in on that part of the argument. And you can imagine why, because Alberta has similar rules proposed. They have not been made into policy or legislation yet. These were announced back in January by the Premier. Very similar, a little bit more strict actually than Saskatchewan's, but very similar. So you can imagine that Alberta's thinking, oh, well, once we make this law, we're going to be facing a legal argument about it in court. So this is a way for them to sort of make their own arguments in a different jurisdiction to some extent on their views on the pronoun policy, but they're also going to be arguing about the notwithstanding clause and the use of the notwithstanding clause, and whether, because they're concerned that if Saskatchewan loses this case, they might be in a position where they cannot protect basically their own legislative agenda. So a bit complicated, a bit of a long rambling answer there, but it's essentially, I think, a setup for what we're going to see in Alberta at some point in the courts when this pronoun policy that Danielle Smith has announced ends up becoming law or regulation, or at any rate coming into effect.
Thank you for that, Tyler. We're out of time, but we appreciate having you on today.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much.
Well, universal childcare programs are seen by many as the answer to challenges faced by many working parents, and it's certainly being promoted that way by our federal government. But is it really the best solution? Well, today's guest isn't a fan of it. Joining us from Ottawa, the Ottawa area, is Andrea Morzek, a senior fellow with the nonpartisan think tank Cardis. Andrea, thanks so much for being with us today to discuss this.
Yes. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, Andrea, you recently wrote an article in the National Post with the headline, "National Daycare Program Builds Federal Monopoly at Expense of Parents." So can you maybe explain what you mean by that and how this is happening? Is it basically the government subsidies messing with the free market, or what's going on?
Yeah. So the reason why we say that the new system is being built at the expense of parents is because so few parents have access to the type of care that the government is choosing to build. So generally in all of the provinces, each province is slightly different, but the funding for $10 a day daycare goes to licensed not-for-profit care. So across the country, you have a majority of parents who are not using that type of care. In some cases, maybe they didn't have access. In other cases, equally, they didn't choose it. They didn't want it. So we basically see the government putting their finger on the scales and saying, this is the kind of care we are subsidizing. This is the kind of care you're going to use. But that kind of care isn't available for all parents with children under 6, let alone children under the age of 12. So that's kind of what's happening with regards to the government choice in the new $10 a day childcare system.
Right. Interesting. So what do you think the government is trying to achieve with these subsidies?
I do think that initially, at least, it was about the cheaper childcare. I think they're quite enamored with the idea of European-style systems. There's reasons why those systems may work better in Europe than here. A lot of that has to do with parental choice and the ways in which we view child rearing here and the diversity of care options that parents are currently choosing. But they're really bought into a model of a daycare system that I believe is out of date and not, it's just not fitting with what parents are doing. I know we all know someone with 3 kids and they chose different care options for each child, and sometimes different care option for the child, for one child, as they go through different ages. So I think the government wants this sort of European style system, if we could call it that, although Europe has a lot of different models, but we could get into that. And so they're choosing that at the expense of what Canadian parents would actually desire.
Okay, and it sounds very confusing to have 3 kids in 3 different daycares. It sounds very frustrating. I can just imagine that household in the morning. But yeah, and I mean, it's one thing to have affordable childcare, right, which we're all for. But, if there's a major shortage of these affordable childcare spaces, then how much of a benefit is it to Canadian parents, really?
Well, So when it comes to childcare, we actually at Cardis define childcare as the care of a child no matter who does it. And that is a very broad definition, and it's one that is very inclusive. So you could have a mom doing no waged work at all. She's doing childcare. You can have a mother doing full-time waged work, and she's also doing childcare. Let's be honest, at the beginning, at the end of her day. So this is not about the mommy wars or saying we prefer one particular course of action for parents. It's really about enhancing parents' choices and acknowledging that people are doing different things and that those choices are legitimate. More than legitimate, it's actually what parents want. So we have this broad definition of childcare. The government has a very, very, very limited definition of childcare. And by that, I mean not even recognizing paid childcare on the ground as it exists today. So licensed childcare is just a section, just a percentage of all of the professional childcare that parents are accessing. A lot of parents will be choosing unlicensed day homes, for example, for the geographic proximity. There's a lot of reasons why parents make different choices for their childcare needs.
Yeah, definitely. Now, why are so many private childcare providers unhappy with these government subsidies?
Yeah, a lot of them signed on with the, definitely appreciating the cheaper childcare that parents were supposed to be getting. I think they're mostly upset because they've been put in the position of intermediary or unpaid accountants, basically, for the system. So there's a lot of bureaucratic work that goes along with navigating the new grants that bring down the cost of childcare. I do know childcares who have had to hire a person to navigate the grants and the applications and the different hoops they have to jump through. So it's extremely bureaucratically onerous. I think that comes through as a major reason. And the governments across the country and in Alberta haven't acknowledged the amount of work that is for childcares. And the government's also been fairly unpredictable in how they've navigated the new system. So, for example, childcares have been asked to sign on to something that basically ensures their viability as a business, but they've been given like a weekend, for example, to read through reams and reams of paperwork. So I think we can all see how that would be very frustrating, taxing, and difficult for small childcares who are in the business not because they love paperwork, but because they love children.
Yeah, that could potentially cause a lot of problems for sure. So what does the research say about the quality of care in government-funded daycare as compared to, say, family care at home?
So just to be clear, all daycare is government funded to a greater or lesser extent, but what you're getting at there is the quality question. And so at Cardis, we are really concerned with all of the types of childcare, and that's not something that we've really studied fully in Canada. The biggest, best peer-reviewed study that we have that included thousands of participants over years, like a decade plus, is from the United States, and it found that center-based care ranked the lowest quality on various choices, and they did attempt to contrast with every form of non-maternal, so basically anything that wasn't the mom, could include dads, grandparents, etc. And they found the quality of care in centers was the lowest. There's a lot of caveats I'd put on that. There is good quality center-based care, but I think that as we funnel more and more kids in that direction, it gets increasingly difficult to fulfill quality requirements because you're pushing more kids into it. There will be pressure to perhaps change ratios, which is one of the quality aspects, right? Yeah, the pressure would be to have more kids per staff member, for example, simply to accommodate more people. That immediately lowers the quality. So I would simply say on that question, we're just not having a very robust quality discussion in Canada at the moment.
Do you know what the percentages of kids that stay at home with their parents compared to the number of kids that go out of home for daycare?
Yeah, so at a bare minimum, it's 40% of kids under 6 are with their parents. That's a bare minimum because of different factors in the data. For example, when they count kids as using childcare, they'll count kids using preschool, but preschool is something that happens at an extremely part-time basis, maybe 2 hours a day, 3 days a week. That might be a preschool program. So a preschool kid is essentially also home with parents, but they get counted as using childcare. So 40% would be, I think, a bare minimum of kids at home with their parents.
Okay, interesting. And what percentage of childcare operators are government funded as compared to purely private childcare businesses?
Yeah, I tried to allude to this earlier on. I don't believe there's any purely private. I think the $10 a day system that we have now is the latest, greatest funding grant. It is the largest for sure, and it's been consolidated via legislation into a system. However, all daycares were using various grants, I think, before for something like space creation, even if it was a private operator. So it's been a long, slow drip of government money to get to the point of the $10 a day system. I think that daycare is expensive, and that's the nature of the business. There's no real efficiencies that you could build in because you're dealing with children. So, yeah, I think daycares, private or not for profit, have been using government grants and subsidies for a very long time.
And do we know what the actual need or demand is for low-cost childcare? Like, is that at the top of the list of priorities for parents, or would they rather use other options to care for their children?
So we are definitely the people who see that big picture, a big ecosystem of care, and a preference for using other forms of care. If you listen exclusively to the mainstream media, you could be forgiven for thinking that there is a huge shortage, a huge demand for care. In certain markets, that may be true. Even in the same market, in a large urban center, you may find places where there's a shortage in one area and then a surplus of spaces in another. I personally have done research into revealing surplus childcare spaces in markets where we were told there were absolutely none. So it's a tricky thing. I don't think that parents are clamoring, though, for exclusive center-based care. What they are interested in is help with their childcare needs, and that could come in the form of money to parents. It could come in the form of tax reductions, et cetera. But there's a lot of different options and a lot of different levers that we're kind of not using when we turn towards this system that the government's chosen.
Now, Andrea, it seems that part of the Liberal government universal child care goal is to see more women enter the workforce. So is this program, it's forking out $30 billion on this. So are we actually seeing a significant increase in women joining the workforce because of this?
Yeah, that was one of the reasons was put forward for having this system, was to increase the number of mothers of young children who would be doing waged work, and that would increase the GDP and help the economy, more workers, et cetera. I don't think we see that kind of influx into the workforce. In English Canada, every province but Quebec, you already had a fairly high number of mothers in the workforce. There was a kind of a theory that we could do what Quebec did. Quebec, when they introduced their program of a system of early learning and childcare almost 20 years ago, they did see an influx of women into the workforce. But that was because they had a lower percentage of mothers doing waged work to start with. And English Canada, the rest of Canada, didn't actually share those percentages. So to tease up that percentage is difficult. There's been a recent study just very concretely saying the $30 billion has been allocated to this childcare program without budging that number at all. So I tend to think that would be, intuitively in my gut, that really resonates. It's going to be hard to do that with an already percentage of women already working.
Yeah. So is it a flaw then that the government seems to be favoring only the one option? Would it be better maybe to make a variety of options available?
Well, certainly these agreements need to be made very much more flexible and I mean immediately as they renegotiate the next round of the next 5 years, we need to see vastly more flexibility incorporated. We need to see private care included. It's absolutely essential that all forms of care be included. And we would say that ultimately parents and family members can also be in providing childcare. And as such, funding the parents is an extremely effective and efficient way of ensuring that everybody can access the billions of dollars that currently the very few are actually getting.
If you were in charge, what kinds of options could they make available to parents that might be better, do you think?
Well, I mean, what we've seen, I think, in many of the moves of the government is that they're steamrolling over this ecosystem of care. So, for example, smaller providers are finding it hard to stay afloat with the current funding model. It's just not easy for them to navigate all of the bureaucratic hoops and still stay in business. So as for, I don't personally believe that it's the role of government to ensure particular forms of care are available. I think the most equitable way of allowing parents to access money is to give parents the money and then allow for them to access care in their local communities that works for them. And it might even be a parent in the home. That's not quite the same thing as saying government should provide X, Y, or Z. It would be a bit more organic than that. But certainly the option to have the cheaper childcare is not available right now for, as we discussed, the majority of families. And that strikes me as being extremely unfair.
Now, at the top there, you were mentioning that the federal government's kind of modeling against the European system. So with that said, are there any other countries around the world who have a better childcare system in place that we could potentially learn from?
Yeah, well, we've always, we have taken some time to study the systems in Europe, and they are different. So it's not fair, actually. I said European style daycare. That's not really fair. Models that we appreciate more, if you were to look at Finland over and above Sweden, for example. So Sweden had this idea of basically more, it feels like Canada's following more of a Swedish path where all children go to one type of care. In Finland, you had more funds available so parents could choose childcare or take in cash to be at home. And that was, I think it's available for the first 3 years of a child's life. So again, any system in Europe that has a greater degree of flexibility. So Finland over Sweden, that's one thing I can point to very concretely. Each European country has their own slightly different approach. And one of the reasons why it's European anything is difficult in Canada is because we're not Europe. I think English Canada has a vastly different tradition and culture that we're coming from. And so it makes emulating these types of programs all the more difficult. But if we do go down the path of creating a system, then we should max out on the flexibility for Canadian parents.
It looks like we are very close to being out of time here, but Andrea, thank you so much for being with us today. Appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thanks for having this conversation.
Absolutely. Andrea Mrozek is a senior fellow with the think tank Cardis. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.